Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's delightful to see you all here. My name is Barnard. I'm Professor of Law at the University of Cambridge and Senior Fellow here at the UK and a Changing Europe. And I've got the great pleasure of introducing a very fine panel with the slightly alarming objective of talking about Britain's global economic and trade strategy. How do we make Brexit work? So to offer their views on this is Thomas Sampson on my left from the LSE, who's going to go first, who's going to talk about trade policy, then Madeleine Sumption on my further on my left from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. And then on my right is Allie, Renison, a recent depart from DBT and now in the private sector, so able to speak a bit more freely about trade issues. I'll have about 10 minutes apiece and I'll give them a warning when their time is up. I want to encourage you all to use Slido. You know the drill. I know some of you don't like it, but it's a good way of getting through quite a lot of questions. But I will, if we've got time, try and take some questions from the floor as well. So, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here. So in keeping with the theme of this conference, I thought I would show you a little bit of research and then talk about a couple of the policy implications of that research. So the work I'm going to show you are some preliminary findings from a research project that's being run by LSE, UCL and Bank of England. And it's a project looking at the effects of Brexit on UK trade. Now, that's a question which obviously by this stage has received quite a lot of attention. But what's different about this project is it's the first project that's trying to address this question using the detailed firm-level customs data that HMRC collects from firms when they do business with either the EU or the rest of the world. And having access to that firm-level data is useful for a couple of reasons that are going to help the analysis. So one is that at the same time that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement came into effect, there was a switch in how the data on UK's trade with the EU is collected. So the two things kind of coincided, which is obviously kind of rather unfortunate if you want a consistent time series of UK trade with the EU. At exactly the moment when our trade policy changed, we also changed how we collected the data. Now, the main effect of that change in data collection was to expand the set of firms that report information on their trade with the EU. So the consequence of that is a kind of upward jump in measured trade with the EU that comes purely from the change in data collection. What we're going to be able to do in this work, though, however, is because we've got the firm-level data, we're going to be able to look at a consistent sample of firms both before and after the TCA comes into effect. And in that way, we're going to be kind of able to sidestep those biases that might otherwise be induced by using more aggregate data. So that's one advantage of the more disaggregated data. The second advantage is that it's going to allow us to look at how different types of firms potentially respond differently to the imposition of the new trade barriers under the TCA. So it's going to allow us to explore whether certain subsets of firms are differentially affected, which will hopefully help us better understand how firms are responding to these new trade barriers that the TCA has introduced. Okay, so with that preamble, let me show you a few kind of results summing up some of the initial findings from this work. So what we're looking at here are estimates of how, at the firm level, a firm's trade with the EU has changed relative to its trade with the rest of the world. So we're always comparing kind of within a single firm, looking at how its trade with the EU has changed relative to the rest of the world, right? And then averaging that over, all the firms in our sample, which is about 20 or 30,000 firms. So we've got a large number of firms we're looking at here, right? And then on these graphs, you can see plotted how that effect changes over time. So if you focus on the figure on the left there first, you can see we start in 2012, then we go up to the referendum, through the period of Brexit and COVID, and then you've got the TCA kind of shaded lightly in yellow on the right-hand side. Right? So if you stare at that graph, the kind of, I think the most obvious pattern is that until the TCA comes into force, there's some fluctuations up and down in relative trade with the EU, but there's no obvious trend in one direction or the other. But then when the TCA hits, there's this very obvious drop. The drop, and the way to interpret the drop is that's lower exports to the EU relative to the rest of the world. Right? So this first figure is showing that, very clearly within individual firms, there is this drop in goods exports to the EU versus the rest of the world that coincides exactly with the introduction of the TCA. So this is consistent with the idea that the new customs barriers that UK exporters faced at the start of 2021 led to a reduction in trade with the EU. The right-hand panel then is showing showing information on what happens for firms, different sized firms. In particular, it's showing the effect for larger versus smaller firms. So the fact that on that right-hand panel you see a jump up when the TCA comes into effect is showing you that larger firms were less affected by smaller firms. So the negative effect in the left-hand panel is concentrated among the smaller firms. Right? Now, to get the overall effect, we kind of need to combine the estimates that are coming from those two different panels. Right? And that gives us a kind of range of estimated effects across different sized firms. But when we do that combination, what these estimates are implying is that for the kind of median firm in our sample, the drop in exports to the EU is around 13% when the TCA comes into effect. So that's giving you kind of an idea of how big the hit is for a sort of average-sized firm. What these estimates also imply, though, is that for the largest firms, in particular for the kind of top 15% of firms, there is no kind of, we can't distinguish a kind of statistically important effect of the TCA. So the way I would interpret that is that the kind of smaller firms that have kind of less internal capacity to deal with the new trade barriers, they're hard hit by the TCA. But larger firms are able to adapt and cope. Maybe, they hire new people to deal with the customs barriers, or they set up some warehousing facilities in the EU, and that allows them to maintain their exports to the EU. So it's really among the smaller firms that the effect is concentrated. Now, here's the same thing for imports, but here we're just showing the average effect, and we're showing that just because on the import side, we don't see the same type of differences by firm size. Firms of all different size on the import side seem to be relatively similarly affected. And again, we see a negative effect for imports. It's slightly larger than for exports. So for the average firm, it's around a 28% reduction. Now, we're still working on kind of understanding why that is, because obviously the UK is only now just beginning to phase in the full set of import checks on imports from the EU. But what it looks like is that there was some substitution of imports away from the EU towards the rest of the world. So kind of once firms knew that the TCA was coming and that these import checks would arrive at some stage, many firms kind of stopped sourcing their imports in the EU and then started sourcing the same goods from the rest of the world. Right, so if we kind of pull all that together, and combine that with, the other research that's been done on the TCA, what can we conclude about the trade effects of Brexit so far? I'd kind of highlight probably 3 points. So the first is that there is clear evidence that, in particular when the TCA came into effect, that there were these negative effects for goods exporters and for importers, but that the biggest effects are really concentrated among smaller and medium-sized exporters. Right? And then the third point, everything I've shown you so far has been for goods. On the services side, the story is actually a lot more positive. It's much harder to detect a negative effect of the TCA on services trade to date. The UK services trade on both the export side and the import side has proved kind of surprisingly resilient so far since the start of 2021. I think more work is needed to understand exactly why that is. But probably, it's a combination of obviously, the kind of customs barriers that goods exporters face are not relevant for service exporters, and maybe also the kind of increasing digitalization of services trade, things like Zoom allow us to provide services remotely more easily than we did in the past. All right, so then the last minute, I just wanted to kind of two policy implications of this research that I want to highlight. One is, I think it's time to move on from global Britain as the kind of motivating strategy for UK trade policy. the idea of Global Britain was that we could kind of diversify our trade, benefit from strong trade growth with the rest of the world. That hasn't really happened either since the referendum or since the TCA. In the current geopolitical environment, there's very little scope for improved, transformational trade deals with major trading partners. The US isn't interested in talking at the moment. The Indian negotiations are kind of dragging on. We'll see if something comes out of that, but it's unlikely to be major in any case. So what that means is that the EU is still by far the UK's biggest trade partner, and I think that for whoever forms the next government, their focus should be on kind of building back the relationship with the EU, and if we can also do improve relations with the rest of the world, that's great, but it should be of secondary importance. So that was one point, and then the final point in terms of thinking about what should the priorities be for the trade relationship with the EU. I think a lot has been written about this. I don't have much to add. People like the UK Trade and Business Commission have put together a very long list of potential recommendations for kind of marginal improvements. The one thing I would highlight coming out of the research is that where we're seeing the biggest effects of the TCA, it's on the kind of barriers that are created by being outside of the customs union, not by being outside of the single market. So if we're thinking about where we want to prioritize efforts that can be most helpful to UK firms, it's on thinking about how to reduce those kind of customs barriers. The kind of regulatory barriers that come from being outside the single market have at least so far proved less important, right? Whereas the reason particularly small and medium-sized exporters are suffering is because of the customs barriers. So I think there's a lot of politics that goes into this, and there certainly isn't political will to think about a close customs relationship at the moment. But if you were going to focus on one aspect of trade policy where you could help improve these relations with the European Union, it would be moving much closer towards some form of customs partnership.
Thank you very much indeed. That's immensely helpful. Madeleine, mobility.
Thank you. So let me see if I have some slides. Okay, brilliant. Yes, thank you for the kind invitation to join. So what I'm going to look at in the next 10 minutes is this question of how well is the post-Brexit immigration system serving the UK economically. Now, if you cast your minds back to, say, around 2019 or so, think about, what were we told about the purpose of the post-Brexit immigration system? Broadly speaking, different people had slightly different views, but broadly speaking, we were told it was going to reduce overall immigration and it was going to lead to a more skill-selective system that would effectively selectively restrict migration into lower wage or lower skilled work, and instead facilitate the types of migration where the evidence suggested there was the greatest economic benefit, i.e. Highly skilled migration. Did it happen? Well, what happened in practice was a little bit unexpected. So EU migration did fall as predicted. It actually fell, so you can see with the sort of teal line, you see a peak in EU net migration. These figures of a net migration around the time of the referendum, and then even before any policy changes had come into place, the EU net migration is falling, but then the real fall takes place with the introduction of the post-Brexit immigration system. It's currently net migration for the EU is actually negative, so more people leaving than arriving. But, of course, at the same time, we've had this unprecedented increase in non-EU net migration to the UK. So, is this because of Brexit? Well, not entirely. Some of these things result from policies or trends that aren't really anything to do with the sort of post-Brexit immigration policy prospectus. So you have the Ukraine schemes that admitted quite a lot of people, and the Hong Kong B&O scheme. That wasn't really part of the overall Brexit policy, and that was particularly important. And these are this is non-EU long-term immigration. You can see that grey line is the primarily Ukraine and Hong Kong schemes, which was very important, particularly in 2022, but is starting to taper off. We've also seen an increase in asylum migration, an increase in recruitment of doctors and nurses into the NHS, which was possible under the pre-Brexit immigration system, and I think is not primarily driven by Brexit, although there may be some impacts around the margins. But I think it's reasonable to say that at least some of what happened was not driven by the post-Brexit system. Some of it, though, is either partially or directly related to policy changes that came in with Brexit. And I think the two big examples here are, on the one hand, we've had the increase in the number of international students, which the timing of which is, I think it's difficult to disentangle the different things that have affected international students, but probably the introduction of the graduate route, so the post-study work visa, has, the general sort of assumption is that that will have been quite influential. And we've also seen an increase in the number of people coming on work visas as more roles have become eligible. And here the big thing, the big show in town is care workers. So this is the number of people sponsored for skilled work visas, which is the main work visa that people come onto from outside of the UK. And the numbers of care workers are really dominating the whole system. As you can see, that's the light blue line. So that was by the year ending September 2023, around half of all skilled work visas were going to care workers. Now we've had these new salary thresholds which have been announced and are going to be coming in April. And the main salary threshold, which is the one that most people talk about, is increasing from around 26,000 to around 39,000. Now that might sound like a very big increase, but actually most jobs that people have been sponsored for over the last year or so are exempt from the salary thresholds and won't be affected at all. So around 70% of workers who came in over the last year were in health or care occupations and a few others that are not subject to those salary thresholds. And among the people who are affected by the salary thresholds, many of them are in graduate jobs that already actually pay quite a lot. And so, they're already paying well over 39,000, and so there won't be a big impact. So actually, the announced reforms, the thing that they leave untouched is the thing that's really driving the numbers, which is main applicants coming on care visas. And the expectation, we'll see the details when they're published, but the expectation is that those are not really going to be massively affected by the policy changes. So what is this new system doing for the economy? I think assessing this is quite is tricky because it's complicated by the fact that we've had this sort of public sector takeover of the work visa system. So when politicians initially were talking about having a skill selective system, I'm not convinced that this is exactly what they had in mind. There has been an increase in the number of people coming into graduate jobs, but the biggest increases have been at the bottom of the salary spectrum, with effectively care workers coming in at just above the minimum wage. Now there are of course benefits for the care sector and benefits for people who need the care sector. And in the short run, it's probably saving some money effectively by propping up a sector where there are really significant staff shortages and a sector that's not properly funded. In the long run, it's not clear whether bringing in 100,000 plus care workers per year is a sustainable solution to the problems the care sector has. Most people working in the sector are still British people, and if the paying conditions remain miserable there, then I think it's going to be difficult to retain them. So just to finish up with some questions really about that I think policymakers are going to need to address over the coming years. I think one of the big ones is what to do about social care. It's possible that the numbers will fall off of their own accord, and that there's been pent-up demand for care workers because they weren't eligible for the visa system, and that after there'd be a lot of hiring take place, and then maybe it'll start to level off a little bit. But it's also possible that those numbers will continue to be quite high indefinitely. There was this interesting thing where the government, around the time when it introduced the points-based system, there was this policy statement in early 2020, and which said, this is going to be a much more restrictive system, but employers will have to adjust. And it turns out that actually what they meant was other employers, so not the ones that are either directly employed by the government or that at least are employed using public money. Because we currently ended up with this interesting situation where we have a much more liberal policy and relatively few barriers to hiring people who are sort of publicly funded workers. Second issue, which I think is sort of less salient politically, is about the costs of the immigration system. And the question I would raise here, and I don't know the answer to it, to be honest, is when do the costs become so high that it actually starts to be a problem? We've seen ever increasing charges for visas, including the NHS surcharge that's paid by workers and any family members that they bring with them. And the Home Office's position on this, there's a real lack of evidence. The Home Office's position is that demand for visas is basically pretty inelastic, and so it doesn't really matter that they can kind of charge quite high fees and it won't put people off. And so far, it does seem that they've got away with it. There is a heavy burden on the applicants themselves, but people are still coming in quite large numbers, as these data show. I think it will be interesting to see what happens with the further increases that are taking place this year, because there must be a point at which it ceases to be true, at which there are certain groups of people who are not willing to pay many thousands of pounds to come here. So, for example, if you think about university researchers who are, in sort of postdoctoral positions who are earning, they're skilled but not massively highly paid. If they're people who are going to be coming with a partner, or especially with children, may just have to pay an amount that is so high it becomes pretty prohibitive. I'll just say a little bit about trade, given that is also that most immigration policy is not really about trade. Obviously, we were told that Brexit would enable trade deals with the rest of the world, and there's a lot of speculation about whether immigration policy can help facilitate trade relationships. So maybe it can be used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. Here, I think there are a lot of constraints here. One is that immigration departments, like the Home Office or in other countries, their equivalents, really hate putting immigration in trade deals. Because it adds complexity to the system. They don't necessarily want to manage a complicated system with different rules for different countries. And then in the UK, there's a specific challenge, which I think India is one of the countries where there's most interest in a trade deal. But it's such a high share of overall immigration to the UK that actually changing your policy for Indians sort of changes your policy overall. It's not like having a little carve out for Andorra. This is, it would be a big deal changing policy for India, and it would affect a lot of people. So personally, I don't expect major concessions in trade deals on immigration, but I could be wrong. And then finally, I think just one question to raise is whether we will ever get any stability in the immigration system. We've seen a lot of changes. I think we appear to be doomed to swing from liberal to restrictive policies and back again with no option for some kind of middle ground, steady state. And this is a challenge, I think, because these changes have costs as everyone adapt. So I think in an ideal world, a little stability might be a good thing. I'm not completely optimistic that there will be any.
Thank you very much for that. Concluding on a level of optimism, thank you. Allie.
Yeah, I may be stealing a prompt a bit from Catherine for the discussion thereafter, but I think one of the questions that we looked at that I wanted to focus on in particular was around what does making Brexit work actually look like? What is it all about? And I wish I'd done slides now. I was told that it wasn't necessary, but I guess when you're on the stage with academics, you should always err on the side of they like the detail. So hopefully I can convey some of that in any event. And as Catherine alluded to, I spent the last 3 years in government, firstly at DIT before it was integrated with the business department, working on kind of basically trade policy engagement with the outside world and also capacity building inside of government, but also in the last years as a policy advisor, civil servant to the Secretary of State. And now I'm back out again. So this is my first foray into the public world, and I hope I don't completely irritate too many sides politically on either one. I think the first thing I wanted to talk about in terms of what does making Brexit work look like is trying to focus on engagement and cooperation, particularly with the EU, on its own terms, on its own merits. I think framing it constantly in the kind of what will it lead us to down the road in the future is unhelpful, particularly politically. I think it gives comfort and succor to the people who, and it'd be interesting to see what the Conservatives do if they are in opposition in terms of their approach on the EU. Will they scream and shout every time there is any kind of hint of cooperation that's announced between a Labour government and EU institutions? But I think that it would be helpful to really focus on engagement, cooperation on their own terms effectively. and what does that mean? What does that look like in practice? It means that being honest about some of the trade-offs. You know, people talk a lot about the TCA review in 2026. I think on the one hand, you know, the TCA would be an opportunity to do a bit of, I don't want to say big bang, because I think unless you rejoin the single market and do some sort of customs union arrangement, the time for big bang effects of trade are probably over for the foreseeable future for the UK, and it's going to be all about incrementalism, which I will come back to in a bit. But if we were to take one of the options of being a bit more ambitious about what we could do with the TCA review, is that it would maybe help put an end to some of the, you know, the multi-year extensions that we keep relying on. You've probably noticed that in the last couple of months, the much vaunted kind of won't they let the expiry date for rules of origin that would have affected EV producers, electric vehicle producers, that the Germans were also quite worried about. They agreed to basically just delay it another 3 years effectively. So the TCA on the one hand could be helpful if we were to make it really kind of an ambitious exercise in trying to have a bit more pulled into one place so that you didn't constantly rely on lots of little changes over time. I think the reality, of course, is that the more that you rely on the TCA as a vehicle, or the review at least, as a vehicle to try and pull some stuff into a more coordinated architecture to improve UK-EU trade and relations alongside it, is that you get a lot more political spotlight on that. And I think it's interesting, I was looking at some sort of self-selecting bias. My old business organization, the IOD, they do these tracking questions, and you know, one of the tracking questions they have is kind of what are the issues that are negatively affecting your business, and you know, the EU relationship has fallen quite some time ago out of the top 5. So I think there was something to be said that, you know, businesses want a little bit of not so much stability, because with incremental changes all the time to the relationship and kind of small cooperation deals, that doesn't give you stability, but it does sort of move it away from being a constant constitutional sovereignty wrangling battle, and I think that businesses are quite exhausted from that. I do think that Northern Ireland is potentially one of the areas in which you might sort of force a new government, or potentially a Labour government, to look more seriously at a more kind of collective, ambitious change to the TCA. But, you know, if anyone was watching the event that was streamed last week from the UK, the Changing Europe, that Catherine also moderated, where you had the EU's ambassador to the UK and his counterpart, it was very much a nothing to see here, everything's working just fine, we don't need to be that ambitious. Now, you could say on the one hand that's also in part because you know, the EU and the UK have elections this year, and so they're being cautious ahead of any kind of elections that might change the geometry of what might be possible. But I think actually that incrementalism is an interesting area for trade between the UK and the EU. I think it's something that businesses in particular need to be able to know how to leverage. I think there's a lot of interesting space around what is the TCA in terms of implementation not doing. Thomas alluded to kind of, you know, the fact that ironically, even though there should be a uniform approach to how, when it comes to customs barriers that have been erected, those should actually be the same in terms of the way that they are felt for, let's say, UK exporters and EU importers across all 27 at the moment, I should say. But they're not. And that speaks to the fact that there are some serious, and this happens when you have an FTA and not, you know, any kind of union or single market structure in place, that those things are implemented differently at the border at the end of the day. Some customs authorities are more facilitative or blocking, shall we say, than others. And I think one of the things that a new government really needs to focus on in terms of making use of sort of incremental measures to improve the situation on the ground for traders is to look at some of the kind of bilateral arrangements. And I have to stress, this is not in place of engaging with the EU. I think the legacy of Brexit has been that the way in which kind of trade cooperation with individual EU countries is framed as a very much either or to kind of engaging with the EU, when in fact actually, you know, trade facilitation, trade promotion is the competence of a member state. Customs policy is the competence of the Commission, but the way it actually rolls out at the border is very much the preserve of the member state. And I think that there is scope. We've already seen, I think, 2 MOUs that haven't really been fully implemented to their fullest ability between the UK and Sweden and the UK and Italy to try and resolve some of these issues, and also look at things like, you know, visa processes, which obviously when you're outside of the EU, outside of the single market, outside of the free movement structures, that sort of resorts back to being more of a competence of the member state in terms of how they engage with third countries. And I think there is some space in there to say, how do we actually make the TCA work properly for businesses in a way that we're seeing a lot of kind of wavering implementation? But I also think incrementalism means looking at how the UK and the EU can cooperate together. I'm almost hesitant to use the word align, but maybe align some of their approaches in international economic fora. I think that the UK has at times been a bit hesitant to jump on kind of EU-sponsored initiatives in the WTO. I'd like to see a lot more of that going forward. You know, it's almost, you know, independent alignment, as it were. And I think that the geopolitics of the last couple of years, particularly with Ukraine, issues in the Red Sea, although I think the response to it divides some of the EU member states, is a helpful actually operating environment to remind the UK and the EU of shared values, shared priorities, and that needs to extend to how they cooperate externally in terms of sort of trade and geopolitical issues. So, I mean, I think sort of suffice to say, just to kind of wrap up, that for me, I think global Britain is not so much a dead phrase that needs to be redefined as very much the EU and I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I think the UK and the EU need to find better ways of working together externally, but also in terms of how they make the TCA work. And I think that, you know, it'd be interesting to see how we've seen Labour be very quiet. I think people were talking a lot about an SPS type of agreement, plant health and animal products agreement, veterinary agreement. I think Labour's gone a bit quiet on that in recent months, for obvious reasons, I suppose. But ultimately, I think whenever a new government is in place, I think that how, you know, a bit of time out of the spotlight for trade, and that sounds awful and terribly non-transparent, but I think the key to cooperation is not making it a constant, huge, big bang sovereignty argument. And so that potentially rules out huge ambitious changes to the TCA. On the other hand, I think there's actually a lot that can be said for looking at trade through a more realistic, incremental prism.
Thank you. That's immensely helpful. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear you advocate that trade should get out the spotlight. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that trade would be sexy and we'd be talking about free trade deals and so forth? On the other hand, the very fact that it looks like something really quite sophisticated has been agreed about the Northern Ireland border shows that actually when things are not in the spotlight, actually quite productive arrangements can be made. I should say that I'm only on page 16 of the government's command papers, so please don't ask difficult questions about that. There's been some great questions that have come in on Slido, which I will put some of these now to the panel. I'm going to start with Thomas because you kindly went first. John Pete's asking, given the data you've shown, how can Brexiteers like Andrea Leadsom deny Brexit created economic damage, and as she did today, argue that FTAs with the rest of the world will more than compensate?
Well, I think it's pretty hard to make an evidence-based argument that is the case. I think maybe Andrea Leadsom doesn't read my research papers, which is fine. Not many people do. But I mean, a flip side of that, though, is that when we did the kind of modelling of what effect Brexit might have before the referendum and while the negotiations were ongoing, inevitably there was a range of outcomes that were produced for how serious it would be. In terms of the trade effects so far, while there has been a negative effect, it certainly hasn't been catastrophic. And to date, the effects have been kind of towards the lower end of the potential costs that people modelled, right? So while it is important to be aware that there have been these negative effects on UK firms, we want to be careful to also kind of be aware that it certainly hasn't, the kind of worst case scenario certainly hasn't materialised in the data.
And what about the compensating effects of FTAs?
So, I mean, I think a good rule of thumb is that the benefits of an FTA depend on how much you trade with the trading partner and how deep the FTA is, right? And we trade 3 times more with the EU than we do even with the US, which is our second biggest trading partner. So, you know, in practice, the effect of FTAs with non-EU countries are always going to be small relative to the impact of our relationship with the EU. I think the government's own estimates put the benefits of each of the Australia and New Zealand FTA at less than 1/10 of GDP. So that, though it thinks there are benefits, they are teeny relative to the losses from leaving the EU.
And on the subject, you pointed out that actually the thing that would actually help business most would be whisper it, some sort of customs union type arrangement. Now, one of the questions here is, could you please give some examples of the distinction between single market and customs union policies and how they impact firms?
Sure. I guess, I mean, at the risk of somewhat oversimplifying, I think you can think of, customs union type policies tend to be things that are going on at the border. So it's things like, the customs paperwork you have to fill in when you export. It's things like rules of origin. It's whether we have a common trade policy with the rest of the EU or not. So those border barriers are mainly linked to our participation in the customs union, mainly though not exclusively. Whereas, potentially the most important aspect of the single market is the extent to which it leads to a kind of regulatory divergence between us and the European Union. And I think, UKICE puts together a very nice regulatory divergence tracker, which I recommend you all go away and read. But the main thing that has pointed out so far is that for all the kind of announcements of regulatory divergence, which the government puts out on a regular basis, for the most part, we've so far kind of hewed quite closely to existing EU regulations in the areas that matter. And I think because of that, the regulatory barriers have so far been relatively minor and had a relatively minor effect on trade.
Thank you. I want to turn now to Madeleine. One of the questions from Lucy White at Bloomberg is, how can government justify expecting businesses to pay overseas recruits more, and as you said, absolutely significantly more, when it exempts itself from the salary requirements through care workers?
Well, you'd have to ask them that, I guess, but I think the jobs, health and care jobs, are politically popular, right? So when you have these surveys where they ask people, about their preferences for admitting different groups of workers, doctors, nurses, and care workers all fare pretty well, and so I suspect that that if you would have sort of put it to people, so if you applied this 39,000 salary threshold to some doctors obviously will make that much, but nurses typically don't, and care workers certainly don't. So if you applied those same salary thresholds, you would really be saying that nurses and care workers can't come anymore, and I think that probably would be reasonably politically unpopular. That said, I mean, these surveys, many people are popular, right? There's a special case that can be made for lots of groups, and if you kind of give exemptions to everyone where there's a nice story about them, then all you're left with is the kind of management consultants and the bankers who don't get any exemptions.
There's a question from Phoebe Warren at Laura Devine Immigration. Are there any countries for which trade deals combined with immigration concessions could prove tenable? And she notes that so far YMS, so Youth Mobility Schemes, expansion has been minor.
I mean, I think that, obviously there are different types of measures that could be in trade deals. I think I always expected to see Youth Mobility Scheme expansion. So this is the 2-year sort of backpacker visa for young people. I always expected those to be extended to Europe. And there have been conversations about it, but I think it's just not really been a priority for anyone. And there are all of these complicated issues about whose competence it is and whether it's an EU thing or a member state thing. Quite properly, it's a member state thing, but I think maybe there's some reluctance on the other side to accept that. So I think, and then of course what happened, I think, what happened then with the really sharp increase in overall net migration is that this probably isn't a time politically when politicians are particularly enthusiastic about the idea of introducing a new 2-year visa that would, at least in the short run, have an impact on the sort of overall net migration statistics. I think there are other areas where maybe I think it seems more politically feasible. So the cost of the visa system is something that a lot of other countries whose nationals come to the UK are worried about, and it's something that, because it's a little bit more technical and wouldn't necessarily have a big impact on overall numbers, probably. I wouldn't be surprised to see more negotiations over costs and trade deals.
Can I just add something to that? I mean, it's interesting if you look at, and I think the Australia-New Zealand relationship was at times used by some people as a model for how the UK and the EU could be a bit more cooperative without sort of having the same level of institutional backing behind it. The big difference being that, unlike UK and Australia, the Closer Economic Relations Act, the Trans-Tasman arrangements, they're not backed by all the institutional provisions that you have with the EU for sort of free movement system, so it's a bit different. But there is effective sort of free movement between the UK and Australia through the TTA and through their arrangements. I just think that because of all the sort of all the judicial and institutional backing that it sits behind free movement, anything that's approaching that's probably quite difficult with the EU. And do we get into kind of third country deals with member states on some of this question mark?
Yeah, you mean between New Zealand and Australia, not the UK
Yeah,
and Australia?
New Zealand and Australia. But is there any kind of scope for kind of third country agreements between individual EU countries and the UK? Probably more in the space of sort of visa liberalisation than sort of full-on free movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think youth mobility schemes are sort of an easier thing to envisage because there's a package that's already there and you can just slot more countries into it, whereas I think there's potentially more suspicion about totally new things that might look a bit free movement-like. I would personally, obviously we still have free movement with Ireland, but yeah, I would personally be surprised to see anything particularly radical. Typically, I think in trade deals, the negotiations tend to be about, these quite technical things, sort of movement of service providers for specific things, which again also end up also having no impact because the bureaucracy, immigration bureaucracies put so many restrictions on how those things actually work.
The US, Canada, Mexico, there are quite complicated provisions for easier movement, and I can tell you between the US and Mexico, it's very difficult to make use of them, as it were. But that's also where recognition of qualifications can act as a sort of parallel facilitation of movement of qualified labor, skilled labor.
That helpfully leads me on to the question that there is I think for you. I mean, you talked about the TCA review, which of course is a review which is expected at the end of 2025, start of 2026. And of course, the Article 776 says it's a review on implementation. And so this brings me to the question, which is there benefit to the EU to use the review to reform the TCA, or will the EU just use the review to do a bit of light dusting?
Yeah, I mean, some people refer to what the EU's putative approach to the review would be as a stock-taking exercise, or ostensible stock-taking exercise. On the one hand, I think, you'll sort of get the line from people in Brussels that it's sort of got bigger priorities to deal with. On the other hand, in a geopolitical context where, you want to actually show to sort of the outside world that you are making progress on kind of economic cooperation with your allies, does that provide an impetus? Does the TCA review end up really just focusing on, foreign security policy, defense cooperation? And I think actually on the one hand, the EU may say that it has bigger priorities. On the other hand, do they want to keep dealing with repeat resolutions like the rules of origin sort of dilemma where they just extended it to 2026. These things keep coming back around. And I actually think, ironically, the UK's much delayed introduction of import controls for sort of EU goods, while is going to be quite disruptive. Not this, the real sort of physical infrastructure bits are being done in April. Today, I should say, this sort of changes more around documentation requirements. But while they may be disruptive, do they actually, because it'll be the EU sort of exporters feeling, I don't want to say for the first time, but kind of in another area, sort of the impact of Brexit properly, does that become an impetus to say, actually, now that the UK has done what we did 4 years ago, maybe we should look at sort of some cooperation to mitigate the impacts thereof, because they haven't felt them fully to date.
And there is a question about whether all of this needs to be seriously rethought in the time of such difficult international circumstances, obviously with war in Ukraine and Israel-Gaza. Do you think that will lead to a change in thinking about the relationship between the EU and the UK and elsewhere?
I think the UK would probably, particularly with the Labour government, be wanting to be more all-encompassing in what it would focus on. I think the EU institutions might. The Parliament's interesting. I think for all the people think that the European Parliament sort of had the most hardball tactics. The likes of Guy Verhofstadt were the people, amongst the people saying we should maintain some sort of free movement for the UK workers, people that wanted it. Actually, I think that the Parliament might take a more liberal line potentially in some of this, and I think with what's going on geopolitically, you would like to think that that provides some kind of impetus and incentive to say, let's try and make this as broad as possible. I think that in the Commission, there may be an instinct to say, let's just focus kind of on foreign security policy, defence cooperation, and not extend to the more sort of chunkier, chewier trade bits.
I'm conscious we haven't taken any questions from the floor. Is there anyone who would like to ask any questions? I think there's a back. Ollie, you going to? Is there a microphone? Thank you.
Just a very quick question.
Hold on, just one moment. We'll just get you a microphone.
Thank you. It's a question about where we're going with Brexit and trade in general. From Allie's reference to the IOD tracker question, if it's slipped out of the top 5 consistently now, does that mean that companies, big and small, are ultimately, with a little bit of a caveat from Thomas, what I was saying about small companies, that really we're finding a modus operandi, we'll get over it? Any view?
I think it depends on the sector. I think in agri-food and drink, it's probably they would love to. I mean, you know, you've heard the strap line that the UK ostensibly has worse access to the EU market than New Zealand does. And obviously, I think the kind of staggered implementation of some of the aspects of Brexit are making it be felt belatedly. And so it's clearly an issue for those sectors where there keeps being delay, even if the delay is the right reason in the first place. If you talk to the financial services industry, and which is comprised of many, many different sectors therein, you know, on the one hand, you can point to kind of the impact of the loss of access quite quickly, the loss of passporting, etc. But actually, I would say that depends on kind of what is the trade-off between alignment to EU rules versus prioritization of access. And I always thought that in financial services, it was a much more evenly balanced argument. And I think with some notable exceptions in some subsectors of financial services, that industry would be somewhat opposed to having done a lot of the kind of relocation or further expansion of their locations into Brussels, into the EU to kind of continue servicing their clients and their operations. They would be a lot more hesitant about kind of having a Norway-style arrangement in terms of obtaining better access, because I think they've settled into that relationship. I think when you look at, it really is sort of sector-specific, and maybe with the Labour government you'll see a bigger focus, despite it being kind of something we don't talk about or was very controversial in recent years, kind of sector-specific deals. You know, lots of people who travelled to the EU to deliver conference or consulting services are really still feel the impact of that. I mean, it was exacerbated by the pandemic's restrictions on travel. But I think it depends on the sector, really, ultimately.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the front. Has anyone else got a question? I'm just particularly looking to see if there's any women who might ask a question. At the back there. Okay. All right. Thank you. So, and I'll, because the time is almost getting short, I'll take your question and then the woman at the back, and then I'll come down. Hello. Okay. Well, since you're up there, do you want to ask your question? Sorry, forgive me. We'll do it the other way round. Forgive me.
It's a question regarding the work visa, particularly with reference to care work. If somebody comes in on a care visa, do they have to work in care? Can they change? Is it what are the sort of parameters of it?
Okay, I'll just the question from the gentleman here. So the gentleman here. Yeah, there's this gentleman here. Yeah, here's one.
Yeah, I'm glad Catherine mentioned Northern Ireland. I work in the retail sector and on the board of Usdaw, the shop workers union. I think the whole issue of trade demands it's a unique solution to a unique issue. You know, the obvious solution is to just trust in the self-policing of the UK retail sector. Even goods being moved from a Basingstoke depot to stores in West Sussex are so remotely tracked from depot, i.e. the notion of a GB truck driver on Northern Ireland duties mysteriously disappearing, you know, it's frankly for the land of asteroids.
Okay, thank you. And a gentleman here briefly, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Yeah, my question actually came back to the care workers, and I was amazed by your 49% figure which you showed, and whether that was stabilising or not. But were you also able to comment upon recent moves which change the way in which care workers from abroad are hired, and the nature of the agencies which are now allowed to hire them, and whether that might improve the potentially high levels of exploitation that are involved now in workers in that sector, in the same way as it was well known was going on in the agricultural sector under rather different rules. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Madeleine, do you want to answer the question too, and then the one about protection?
Yeah, so the answer on do people have to work in care if they're on a care work visa? Yes, they have to work in the specific job that they're sponsored for. They can, in theory, change to another employer if they but they'd have to submit a new application, and that would have to be an eligible job as well. So the care work visa provides a route to permanent settlement. So after 5 years, they could then apply for permanent status here, and at that point they could move out of care. And I think one of the interesting things to follow will be to see what share of people do, whether they see it as basically I serve my 5 years in care and then I'm allowed to do whatever I want, or whether after that period people like the job enough that they want to stay on. The risk, of course, is that they won't, if given that the pay and conditions in the sector are not very good. On the question about the recent regulations, I think I don't think that the changes, so for example, requiring sponsors to be registered with the Care Quality Commission, are going to be enough to prevent exploitation in the industry. I think that hopefully it will bring some improvement, but I think that a lot of the exploitation that we see takes place before people even get to the UK through the agencies that are active there. It's very difficult for the UK to regulate them, and they have all sorts of knock-on problems because people arrive and they're in substantial debt, which then means that they have much less bargaining power vis-a-vis their employer. So I think it's a deeply rooted problem, and I think it will be difficult to address it.
Thank you.
Yeah, just on Northern Ireland and retail, I think if you had an interest in trying to improve quite substantially the TCA, you would wish that there were more companies trading between GB and NI, because I think ironically, I mean, the DUP have helped keep it on the one hand in the news and tried to focus lots of attention on the other hand, their solution was ostensibly to try and blow it all up. That's a terrible pun, which I didn't intend whatsoever. But it's a shame because, ultimately, on the one hand, the Windsor framework brings a kind of architecture that tries to resolve some of this, but the more that you resolve it through a very complicated set of measures, I think, the top line was business was very happy with the Windsor framework. The bottom line was actually, in practice, it's very, very complicated. It's bringing constantly more and more changes to try and solve problems, and it's, it will be an ongoing issue. And so I think that if there was more attention paid to some of the, not just implementation, but sort of existential issues for trade between GB and NI, I think that would be a bigger tail to wag the overall UK-EU, what do we do about this dog? But the Windsor framework has, I think, provided a kind of baseline where people think that everything's fine, when in fact the implementation is quite complicated, shall we say. So I'd be very curious to see what Labour do if they get into government about how much attention they want to give this problem.
Thank you. My time is almost up. So I have one question to ask each one of the panel. I would like you to come up with one thing that you think that is deliverable that could make the relationship between the UK and the EU better. Madeleine.
On migration, I think that youth mobility schemes are deliverable. I don't know that they would transform the UK-EU relationship, but they may be some impact.
Okay. Thank you.
So I guess on trade, trying to improve the trading conditions for kind of agri-food in particular should be a priority. So some kind of SPS agreement seems like an obvious step.
I'd say recognition of professional qualifications by sector and customs cooperation to make the TCA actually work on the ground uniformly.
Brilliant. Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed to our wonderful panellists. Thank you to you.